Hello everyone, this is Mr. Abunis and welcome to World History 2. This week we're going to be talking about World War II, and then I think this module is actually going to last up to 2 weeks, so you'll have 2 weeks to actually get all this stuff done. So just like last week, you're going to listen to this lecture, and then you are going to go and do a web quest for me. Alright, so with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start off with the essential questions. These are the questions that I'm going to be trying to be answered during this PowerPoint. So you can see first up on there, you got what were the causes of World War II, what were some of the major events, who are some important leaders, and just as a warning, there are a lot of important leaders during World War II. If we're doing this during a normal class period of time, we probably would spend a lot of time going over the vocab because quite frankly, there's just a lot of vocab and a lot of people that are important to know. After that, we'll talk about the Holocaust, and you will actually, for your web quest, there will be a video on the Holocaust you watch from Crash Course that you'll answer a few questions on. And then connecting to the Holocaust on the bottom, we'll talk about a few other examples of genocides that have happened in this last century. And then moving on to the end of World War II, how did World War II come to end, and what are some decisions that were made after World War II was over? Finally, again, going on to that, you have how did the United States, build the world up again, and what are some of those big organizations that get created after World War II? So here is an iconic picture of World War II. For those who do not know, this is the storming of the beaches of Normandy at D-Day. So United States, just like in World War I, we were actually late to joining this war. We were the last ones to join. If you remember Pearl Harbor, the day that will forever live in infamy, I think that was in December 1941. So it took us about a year and a half, closer to 2 years in a lot of cases, to actually join the war while it was still raging in Europe and in Asia. All right, so here comes the official beginning of our lecture for Module 2. So just a reminder, just like last time, what I want you guys to do is, as I'm talking, take notes on a separate sheet of paper. And also as a reminder, this information is not only good for this year, but when you guys take U.S. history next year, a lot of this information will also reappear again. So it's always good to try to get a jump start for next year and have this background knowledge in your head already. All right, so some of the causes of World War II. First off, if you recall from our previous module, Germany and then also Italy and Japan were totalitarian powers, which means they had basically dictators in charge, and those dictators were rapidly trying to expand their territory. And then at the bottom here, you can see how did the other countries respond to these countries trying to expand their territory? And the answer was basically appeasement, giving in to them, saying, all right, Germany, you can take this part of Czechoslovakia. All right, you can take Austria. All right, you disagree. You can take the Rhineland too, I guess. But after all that, you promised to stop, right? And of course, Hitler on those treaty meetings would just nod his head saying, sure, I will not take any more than that. And then once that treaty was done, he would immediately take over another place. And eventually, Poland's going to be the last thing that he takes, the last straw. And all the European countries, Western European countries, England and France, finally decide they need to declare war on Germany. And no matter what, he's not going to stop. Some other causes you can talk about. Treaty of Versailles being unfair. If you remember, the Treaty of Versailles for World War I blamed Germany exclusively for the war and punished them very harshly. And as a result of that treaty, a lot of people say that caused the rise of Hitler by using that treaty as a basically blaming for the reason why Germany is struggling. Also during this time period, you used to talk about the League of Nations, that peacetime body that got established. And unfortunately, the League of Nations was not really effective, partially because they really had no power to stop Hitler beyond basically wag their finger at him. And where was the United States during all this? And the answer is we were isolationists. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we did not even join World War II until about 2 years into it. So while all this militarism was happening in the world, United States was on the other side of the Atlantic trying to mind our own business and say, let Europe be Europe, let Asia be Asia. All right, so this is a map of World War II, at least on the European side of it. So I'm just going to basically, on this map, go over a very, very fast overview of the events of World War II. One of the sad things I'll share with you guys what my professor in college used to tell me. Us historians, we care about the causes of a war and the effects of the war. But the actual events of the war normally don't get covered as much. Mainly, because, I don't know. He didn't really know number why either. He said mainly, I guess we couldn't really write good books on it about historical thinking and yada yada yada. So unfortunately, I am going to go over these events of the war. And I know there's a lot of people who love talking about World War II and all the little minor details of it. And I guess my answer is, unfortunately, we do not have enough time to go over the exact, this battle, and this battle. If you're really into that, great. I love you for it. But unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to indulge those things too much. So essentially, how the war starts: Germany invades Poland. So you can see this war star right here used to be where Poland was. Germany invades Poland from one side, and actually at the beginning of the war, they were allies with the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east side. But then eventually during the war, about a year or two into the war, Germany actually betrays the Soviet Union. And if you can see right here, Germany actually invades the Soviet Union. And this is, I think, this is World War II at the beginning of 1942. So you can see how Germany has advanced all the way to Moscow and a very big battles in Stalingrad. But once Germany gets to about this point, this is when they start having problems in the Soviet Union due to the fact that it gets really, really cold in the winters. And also, the Soviet Union is a lot bigger than you would think it is. So for those reasons, Germany enters a stalemate there in the Soviet Union. And then eventually, starting in 1943, the Soviet Union is going to get its act together and actually start pushing Germany back. And slowly but surely, Soviet Union is going to push all their way to Berlin. Meanwhile, on the western side of things, for France, at the beginning of the war, Germany was very successful. They actually are able to conquer France and take it over very quickly in about a month. And France is pretty much an occupied territory until almost the end of the war. The United States, we eventually joined the war, and as a result of us joining the war and the tide of the war going against Germany, you can see right here the Battle of Normandy on this map is when the United States, with a joint force of England, are able to start making a beachhead, rejoining into France, and then slowly you can see we also make our way towards Berlin as well. And it really became a race to Berlin between the France and England and the Soviet Union on how the war was going to come to an end. So here's just some bullet point things telling you guys the major events of World War II. I've already mentioned a few of these. So the war starts officially with Germany invading Poland. And then immediately after the invasion of Poland, once the war begins officially, Germany is able to take over France very, very quickly with a battle strategy called Blitzkrieg, which really just means lightning war. Germany comes in there fast with a lot of airplanes and tanks, and it's able to take over France really before France is able to even really get ready for a war. I didn't mention the Battle of Britain, but what was England doing during this time period? Well, essentially they were an island, so they were cut off from the rest of the continental Europe. So Hitler wanted to take over England, but he was not able to because he wasn't able to transport his army across the English Channel. So instead, Hitler tried to bomb England and basically make them shell-shocked to the point where they'd just give in to Hitler's demands. But England was able to resist that, and they kept on fighting on. So Battle of Britain, a lot of English people see it as a victory for them for enduring the onslaughts of the German airplanes. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, Germany betrays the Soviet Union, who was their ally, and invades them. And then right after that, Japan does Pearl Harbor on us. And the biggest important thing for Pearl Harbor for the war's sake is that officially causes the United States to also declare war on Germany and Japan. And then eventually the war starts turning. We do D-Day, we invade France, and then we are able to take over Germany. And once Germany is conquered, believe it or not, Japan is still fighting the war. So to get Japan out of the war, that is when Truman, our current president then, decides he's going to drop Hiroshima and Nagasaki the atomic bombs. And that is a major decision in world history that a lot of historians debate. Should we have dropped those atomic bombs, or should we have just invaded with soldiers and not killed innocent civilians? And a lot of people go back and forth on that. Like the reason why Truman said he did it was mainly because to invade Japan would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. All right, so here's just some images of the war. So you can see the atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki right there in the middle. On the top right, you can see I think that's Blitzkrieg, German invading France, doing it very quickly in only about a month. I like the bottom right little picture there. So why did the German army get stuck in the Soviet Union and weren't able to fully invade it? And one of the answers right there is the cold winter of Russia, and how the German army really was not prepared for that cold winter. And of course, this middle picture, the middle bottom picture, is an iconic picture of the war. This is Pearl Harbor, when Japan did a surprise attack on our military base in Hawaii and sunk a lot of our battleships. All right, as I mentioned for this unit in general, there's a lot of people you need to know. And quite frankly, these are all like super important people you should know. I just put in bold some of the ones I'm going to especially talk about today. So you have Franklin Delano Roosevelt is our president for most of the war. He actually dies in office after getting elected for his fourth term as president. So he actually was president for about 13 years, I believe. And then like the beginning of his fourth term is actually when he dies. And when he dies, his vice president is Harry Truman. And Harry Truman's the one who actually ends the war. And as I mentioned earlier, he's the one that officially decides to drop the atomic bombs. I will not mention Eisenhower and MacArthur too much, but they were two big, important American generals during the war. Eisenhower is the guy who actually was the official commander leading the D-Day invasion. George Marshall was a general, and eventually he's going to become a Secretary of State who helps do a lot of policies when it comes to helping Europe recover. In fact, there's a plan named the Marshall Plan after him. Churchill is the Prime Minister of England, and you can see Stalin and Hitler. Hopefully you know those two already, leaders of their respective countries. Mussolini's in Italy. And then in Japan, Tojo is the general / prime minister who we blame for Pearl Harbor. And then Hirohito is the emperor of Japan. So here's just some of the images of these leaders. And again, we're just going to do a very brief thing on here. On the left, you have Eisenhower, again, the leader of our forces in Europe. You have FDR, who was our president for most of the war. And then, of course, fun fact about him, he actually had polio. So as he was president, he was in a wheelchair the whole time. So he's the only president we've had, at least that we know of, who was president while being disabled. And then we have General MacArthur. And MacArthur, most of his battles, he is mostly known for after his war, when he actually gets assigned to the Pacific, and he actually is going to watch over Japan when we occupy it after the war. And he will actually be a general when we do the Korean War. And I think is that the 60s, or actually that's 50s, I think. And then last but not least, you have Harry Truman right here, and he'll be our president to end the war, and he'll actually be president for about 4 more years after the war as well. And then here's more people you need to know. So hopefully you know Hitler right there. Next up, you have our George Marshall, who's going to be a general during the war, more logistics, and eventually our Secretary of State. Our Secretary of State's basically our head foreign policy officer, so he's like really the right-hand man of the president especially during wars. And then you have Joseph Stalin, who's the dictator of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union is going to be our allies during this war after Hitler invades them. And eventually the Soviet Union, of course, is going to be our great rival during the Cold War. So he's our ally turned enemy later on. And then we have Churchill right here, who's going to be the Prime Minister of England. And English people love Churchill because they see him as the guy who was able to get them through World War II. And then finishing off some important people. So on the left, you have Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. Eventually, his people are going to turn on Mussolini during this war, and he is going to be killed during World War II. Hirohito is the emperor, and then Tojo is the guy we blame for everything. And then fun fact, just so you guys know, after the war is over, we actually, all the blame for Pearl Harbor again gets put on Tojo. So actually Hirohito, we allowed to remain emperor of Japan, and he continues to rule Japan until his death, which I think he actually ruled for a really long time. I don't think he stopped being emperor until like in the 1980s when he died of old age. All right, so the other thing we need to talk about World War II is the Holocaust that happens during this time period. So we already talked a little bit about anti-Semitism that rose in Germany during the 1930s. If you actually look at European history, the history of being anti-Semitic actually happened for centuries and centuries against the Jews. So This prejudice against them was not something new, although the industrial scale of this extermination and genocide that happened against the Jewish was on an unprecedented scale. And it was so unprecedented that even though there were reports of this extermination happening during World War II, most allies like France, England, and United States didn't believe the stories that they were hearing until when they were conquering Germany and they actually saw these extermination camps, and it was worse than they even imagined. And one of the famous terms, which you can see at the bottom of the slide right here, Hitler called this his final solution. So he thinks Jewish people are inferior people and that we just need to get rid of them. And initially in the 1930s, some of his plans was just making them, trying to slow down the population growth of Jewish people until eventually they just no longer reproduce. But especially as the war starts turning on Hitler and he realizes he might not win the war, they actually increase the amount of killings in there, even just crowding a bunch of Jewish people into gas chambers and gassing them. And that is his final solution, just trying to kill all the Jews. And here's just some pictures of that. So initially, one of the things you can see on here in the top left picture, he made Jewish people wear the Star of David to identify them as Jews, then everyone in public knew who they were. And then one of the questions there is, how do you know someone's Jewish? And you can see right on the right there in the big little document right there, is they actually broke it down to like if, by parent lineage. So maybe your grandparent was Jewish, and if your grandparent Jewish, that could be enough to consider you Jewish, even if you don't consider yourself Jewish as well. And then if you're ever in Germany, some of these extermination camps and labor camps that I just mentioned are still around as historical sites. So you can go and visit those and basically witness the horrors of World War II. And there is a lot of Holocaust denialism still going on today, even though there's a wealth of evidence that prove it's happened. So if anything, I think these sites are important and worth seeing, just reaffirming that these things did happen. And those people denying them, I don't know what's going on with them. Just please don't give them any credibility. And then really briefly, we'll just talk about other genocides that happened in the 20th century in general. And one of the things that people try to push away from the Holocaust is that genocide was definitely just a Hitler and Germany thing during the 1930s and 40s. It's not something that humans usually do. And unfortunately, if you actually look at human history, genocide is something that is more common than you would think it would be. And sadly, if you think that during the Holocaust, maybe if you were in the position of some of the Nazi people, you wouldn't end up killing people. And I think the sad psychological answer is more people than not would kill other people if the circumstances were right. So some of the more bigger genocides we'll talk about, you have the Armenians, which was a minority group in the Ottoman Empire, present-day Turkey. They were killed a lot during World War I because they were seen as anti-Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was also Muslim, whereas the Armenians were generally Christian. Joseph Stalin, who was our ally during the war, well, guess what? He was a dictator, not necessarily a great guy. And arguably speaking, he ended up killing more people than Hitler throughout his reign as the dictator, Secretary General of the Soviet Union. He also had a few more decades than Hitler, but still he ruled with an iron fist. Another guy who we mentioned as a horrible dictator that killed a lot of his people would be Pol Pot. He was the leader, the dictator of a country called Cambodia, which is in Southeast Asia. And essentially, he wanted to make an idyllic agrarian farming society where he would actually force people to leave the city and do basically slave labor in fields and horrible conditions, which would cause many, many people to die. And last but not least, the Hutus and Tutsis, which a lot of people, this is the most recent genocide, so maybe you've heard of this in Rwanda. Rwanda is a small country in Africa where the Tutsis were massacred by the Hutus. And here's just a map showing you some of the things on there. You can see how Rwanda is a small country. And some people might ask, why do the Hutus kill the Tutsis? And the answer to that was really just because Europeans kind of favored one ethnic group over the other. And then once Europeans left, that ethnic group that was basically persecuted by the Europeans was actually the majority. So then they took out basically their rage against that minority that had basically been abusing them throughout that time period when Europeans were taking over. All right, so brief recap of World War II, and again, this is very brief recap of World War II. So essentially, after the war was over, Europe in general was completely decimated by the war. The United States, we were pretty much okay because remember, most of the battles actually didn't happen in the United States. So one of the number one goals of the war after the post-war was to try to basically rebuild Europe, and that's the Marshall Plan right there. We actually give them a lot of money, Western Europe a lot of money to try to rebuild those economies. Another thing that's about that we'll talk about more in the Cold War, which is getting up into the upper right corner about the Iron Curtain, is that Europe is actually going to get divided in half. Western Europe is going to be capitalist and democracies, whereas the eastern part, which is conquered by the Soviet Union, is going to start becoming communist. And the Iron Curtain is supposedly that division line dividing, communist Europe to democratic Europe. And the other things I'll mention really quick is the war crimes. So very famously, once a lot of those Nazis are captured, we do the Nuremberg trials, where we put those Nazis on trials for crimes against the humanity, and all their crimes are put up on public display. All right, so here's just a map showing some of these things. So in the middle map right there, you can see that black line is the Iron Curtain. Notice how Germany is split in half. So the Soviet Union is actually able to conquer Berlin before we're able to get there. So the Allies, United States, France, and England get most of Germany, but probably the most, I guess, psychologically most important part, Berlin, is actually surrounded by the Soviet Union. And the city itself is actually divided up as well. So Soviet Union gets half of Berlin, and then the United States and England, we get the other half. But you can notice it's kind of funny for that, where Berlin is actually surrounded by the Soviets. So there's like this little tiny island of capitalism, democracy surrounded by communism. And again, this is getting into Cold War, which we'll talk about more about next unit. The last thing I want to point out too is that Marshall Plan, where the United States really just gave a lot of money to the Western Europe. And you can see right here, England and France are the ones who received the most. And one of the reasons why we ended up investing a lot of this money in these countries was really because we are worried if we don't prop up these economies and save these economies, we worried that communism would befall these countries. And remember, communism equals evil in our minds for the United States, especially during the Cold War. And what about Germany and Japan? Are we going to blame them for the wars and make them and give them harsh things like we did during World War I? And the answer is no. We try to treat Western Germany and Western Berlin as fairly as possible. We make them democracies, we make them capitalist, and one of the things we like to point out very poignantly is those countries did very, very well during the Cold War. In fact, Japan today is one of the leading economic powers of the world. But we do occupy Japan, and we don't occupy them anymore. However, some of those restrictions in Japan still remain. If you see in the top right corner, I think no, we don't actually mention it in here. I thought we mentioned it in here, but part of the treaties of Japan that we actually mentioned is Japan's not allowed to have a military. So today, even today, they don't technically have a military; they have a defense force. And here's just a picture of General MacArthur. And as I mentioned earlier, we occupy Japan, and on the right is Emperor Hirohito. And like I said, it's a relatively peaceful occupation after this war. Some of the big organizations that we will talk about, and we'll talk about more next unit mostly, is the United Nations. So the United Nations is the international community that's tasked with making world peace happen. If you recall, the League of Nations tried that after World War I, but failed, partially because the United States didn't join. So now we have the United Nations that's still around today. And I would say, I guess it's kind of successful because we haven't had a big world war, although a lot of people still criticize the United Nations because it really doesn't have a lot of enforcement powers. It has some enforcement powers, but there's still genocides that happen and there's still wars that happen in the world. And NATO and the Warsaw Pact are something we'll talk more about, the Cold War. But essentially, NATO is a military alliance with those Western European countries that are democracies. And the Warsaw Pact is an Eastern European alliance with the communist countries. So it's basically, again, you have capitalist democracies versus communist countries. And the last thing we'll talk about today in our notes is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a document that was signed by the United Nations. And think about the context of this. After the World War II, we just saw the Holocaust and a bunch of atrocities happen where their own government was killing people. So this document basically is saying universal, so everyone has certain human rights that their governments can't do against them. Now, you could argue what's the enforceability on this, and the answer is not too much. However, it is now an international norm of expectations of what governments are allowed to do and governments are not allowed to do. All right, so that is it for your notes today. So just a reminder what you need to do moving forward. You need to go to your team assignment for Module 2 Web Quest, and you'll be doing a web quest on World War II. Once that web quest is done on the Google form, again, you don't have to upload anything to me. Just make sure you hit submit on the form, and I can track what work you did. And if you want feedback on your work, which I hope you do want feedback on your work, I've answered the questions for you. So after you hit submit, you can see what my answers were for the questions, so you can see how well you did. And of course, as usual, if you have any questions for me, please send me a reminder or send me an email, and I will always get back to you. All right, guys, thank you for listening to me ramble on for about 25 minutes. Hope you're staying safe.